So, I just got done with finally finishing up the Dept retrospective and thought to smush all 5 individual videos together into a supercut for easy viewing. If you've watched the episodes individually, pretty much everything is the same except I edited out all the outros and changed the ordering a little bit. Anywho, yeah, that's it. I hope you enjoy it if you haven't seen it already, and I'll see you in the next thing I cover. Road intro! Hey everyone, Zirin here. So recently I've gotten into playing a series near and dear to my heart, one I started over a decade and a half ago, the Dept series by Sting Entertainment. Dept is many things, difficult, unwieldy, but most importantly, it was a series that was never afraid to try something completely new. I'm going to go on a limb and make the assumption that most people are probably unfamiliar with this series, mostly because there are only 4 mainline entries and it hasn't seen a new entry in nearly a decade. The Dept franchise was 4 games developed by Sting Entertainment. Although it is considered a series, they are not directly connected, but rather thematically through an amalgamation of Norse mythology combined with Japanese elements, and through the uniqueness of each game's mechanics, which if you know anything about me, that's what I'm all about. There are 4 entries or episodes as they are labeled. Episode 1, Riviera, The Promised Land in 2002 on the Wonder Swan and later Game Boy Advance. Episode 2, Yggdra Union Will Never Fight Alone in 2006 on the same console. Episode 4, Nights in a Nightmare in 2008 on the DS. And Episode 9, Gungnir, Inferno, The Demon Lance and the War of Heroes in 2011 on the PSP. Which sounds like an overly long title, but at least it kinda makes sense as opposed to something like 12 Riven, the Cycliminal of the Integro, which, yes, is a real title to a game. The astute viewer out there might have noticed that the numbering might be a little off. No, I didn't have a brain spasm, that's just how this series was labeled. Episode 3 was meant to be a PC MMORPG that never came out. Episode 5 to 8 just straight up never existed. Just think of it as a really quirky numbering system to go along with the rest of the weirdness. Also, every single game except for Gungnir has remakes on the PSP, since that was Gungnir's native platform. For the next 2 weeks or so, I plan on hitting up all 4 of these games one by one, starting with Riviera. However, I want to give an overview of sorts to the entire series, and a bit about the company behind it, Sting Entertainment, today, so that you have a better idea of what to expect coming to each game. And most importantly, I can focus directly on each game individually as we get to them. What I appreciate the most about the Dept series is that every single one of these 4 games, regardless of how good or polished they actually are, all try to have different and unique mechanics that you don't see in other games. They also are, for the most part, pretty tough and challenging games, which I find to be a whole lot of fun, and it also helps that they have this rough anime SD art style going on that I just plain like. I think the only one that can be considered having a easy difficulty would be the first entry, Riviera, The Promised Land. And even though I said just now, regardless of how polished or good, I think most of the series are just great experiences as a whole, with the rough part only adding to the appeal of these hidden gems. The reason why I want to talk about it in the first place was because I found myself honestly having a pretty enjoyable time playing the PSP remakes, and I also felt like it was a series that didn't really ever get its time of day. Another part I just love about this series is that it has a very old school way of having secrets and collectibles. Multiple endings, plenty of secrets, and an absolute ton of hidden items in every game. The Dept series is honestly a completionist's nightmare, but for the average player, it's a lot of fun to just discover all there is to every game and getting used to every system. I think the stories and themes for most of these games are also rather nice as a whole. Underneath its cute anime art style, there is actually a decently serious storyline that doesn't always have a happy ending. Many of the characters face some pretty tough situations. The stories in each game cover a war tale from a different perspective. Yggdra Union as a classic princess of a ruined kingdom fighting back against an evil empire, Knights in the Nightmare as a forgotten spirit wandering through the aftermath of a kingdom once prosperous, but now ravaged by war, and Gungnir as a juvenile son of a persecuted minority population who ends up leading a rebellion against a powerful empire who seeks to crush them permanently. Riviera is there, I guess, but again, it's probably the odd one out, being a pretty happy-go-lucky JRPG for the most part. I think the world surrounding the Dept series is also pretty cool, which itself is based around Norse mythology, but switched up to throw their own spin on it. The Grim Angels, Sacrifices, Valkyries, Einherjards, tons of the good stuff. Music as a whole throughout the series is also quite outstanding, which is fairly impressive considering it started on the Wonder Swan of all things. Shigeki Hayashi and Minako Adachi do a fantastic job, and playing the songs are dang good. They fit the games incredibly well and give them a vibrant sort of energy that they otherwise wouldn't have. Now let's get into talking about Sting Entertainment itself. The reason why I started out by assuming most people haven't heard of this company is because even though they've been around since the 1990s, every game they've released outside of Dept series has been either Japanese only, extremely obscure, really bad, or a mixture of all three. I mean, I know Treasure Hunter G on the SNES, but that's only because I checked out the Aeon Genesis fan translations. They've re-released Baroque, and having played a little bit of the Wii version, it definitely isn't for everyone. From what I have seen, most of their other games that they have personally developed and not just helped out on, have received some pretty mixed reception. Heck, aside from Dokapon Kingdom, which is admittingly a pretty fun board game if you really want to backstab your friends, they haven't done anything of note aside from the Dept series, and the last entry in that was 2011's Gungnir. Apparently, they helped out with the battle system for Utareru Mono Itsuwari no Kamen and Futari no Akoro, which is a two-part amazing visual novel that I really love and would suggest you play, but I wouldn't really consider that as them releasing a game. The last thing they released is Dimension Traveler 2-2, and I'm not even gonna pretend like I know anything about that game. Well, okay, I guess it's actually the Dokapon Kingdom other spin-off using the Utareru Mono brand, but yeah, same thing. From what I can guess, Sting Entertainment has moved on from making their own games to assisting others in their gameplay department, which I find to be a dang shame. I think the magical part of the Dept series was just how crazy they went with every single game system, that it truly felt like a unique experience every time that I wouldn't see in another game series. This combined with their actually decently made stories with serious storylines and fun characters is what kept me coming back time and time again. While the battle systems in the games they helped on are certainly serviceable, they're just kind of normal and expected as opposed to the craziness that was the Dept series. While this franchise never felt like a AAA game by any means, and it most certainly isn't, I think that's kind of the charm of it. Just like the PC Dojin games I love talking about, the Dept series always felt like a surprise, where even the audience didn't have any real way to guess how the next game in the series would play out, or what it would even be about. It was exciting to eagerly anticipate what the series would try next. Sure, at times the gameplay can be a little too out there, and might even make the player want to tear their hair out, but I never felt as if the gameplay was something I've seen a million times before. Even if the game wasn't all that great, like in the case of Gungnir, at least it was interesting. I would have loved to seen an episode 5 to 8 of the Dept series come out, and if Sting Entertainment ever decided to suddenly make another entry on a portable machine like, say, the Switch, I'd be down to play it. They still hold the license to the series, and Sting Entertainment is still an active company, even if they haven't released a game on their own in quite some time. So it is a possibility, granted a low one, but hey, Utareru Mono got a sequel like a decade after the original PC release, so anything is possible, right? Anyhow, yeah, I'll be covering the rest of the Dept series one by one in the coming weeks. I'd wager that if anyone has ever played a Dept game, it would probably have either been Yggdra Union or Dept Episode 1, Riviera, The Promised Land. Looking back on this entry in the franchise almost 2 decades since its first release, Riviera is certainly the safest game, I would say, out of the 4. The story is pretty standard for the most part, while I think every Dept game contrast cute SD characters with a surprisingly serious and dramatic war story, Riviera is a fairly fluffy game where Etzo, or Ein as he is localized as, runs around with his harem of girls. I mean, it's not entirely cute. Serene's entire race of Arcs has just recently been subjected to a genocide, but the focus is really on Ein solving problems with his party comprised entirely of females. While most of the other entries are full of incredibly diverse mechanics which you gotta learn or the game throws you 3 ways into Sunday, Riviera is pretty content to let the player enjoy the ride without too much effort on their part. Still, I'm only calling it the safest in relation to the other games in the Dept franchise. I think it still has plenty of very unique gameplay features that you don't normally see in other JRPGs. Tons of secrets to discover, and several different endings, even if it's based on a simple affection meter. Theoretically, if the game was adjusted a little bit, it would have a great gameplay loop. As it currently stands, however, if I had to say which of the 4 games I would consider a great game, it would probably be third on the list. However, if I had to say which one I had the most nostalgia for, Riviera might potentially be number 1 or 2. Anywho, I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's get started by talking about what exactly is Riviera. Riviera the Promised Land came out originally under WonderSwan Color way back in 2002, although, as you might have guessed, I didn't play that version. Which honestly might have been a dang shame, because while that version has terrible music, check out the hair of Lada and Ein, hot damn! Instead, I played the one most people are probably familiar with, the Game Boy Advance version. It later got an enhanced remake in the PSP, which is what I will be showing off here, because this is the version with the enhanced screen, cleaner graphics, cleaner soundtrack, and full voice acting for all the characters. It's even got Japanese and English voice acting. I think the Japanese voice acting is a bit better than the English one for this game, but both are decent.
No, they're still very strong. These must have been destroyed in order to build a barricade.
Okay, so I lied. The English one is pretty bad at times, but I think that mostly comes from a place of how the script is written and text is displayed. Using the exact same clip as an example, it's pretty clear that the Japanese voice actor for Sierra was given the lines that formulate either whole sentences or goes into another one naturally.
この木々にはまだ支えるだけの力があるわ。おそらく外部からの侵入を拒むため故意に壊されたと考えるのが自然ね。
While the English voice actor sounds like someone starting 3 new sentences with each click. On the other hand, I prefer Ein's English voice actor over their Japanese voice actor, so, you know, there's a bit of good and bad on either side. Moving on to the story, Riviera the Promised Land takes place in, as you might imagine, Riviera. Apparently, Japan thinks Norse mythology is just the coolest thing ever, which I do entirely agree with. So much of the background of the Dept series borrows many elements from Norse mythology. In the world of Riviera, Asgard and Utgard are the homes of the gods and demons respectively. The gods were losing the fight, so they chose to sacrifice themselves to create grim angels who wield diviners. The Grim Angels helped end the war, and both gods and demons were sealed away, with the gods creating sprites to help manage their leftover knowledge in Utgard, now named Riviera. 1,000 years later, the demons are starting to make a return onto Riviera, leading the Magi, who act as the proxies of the god, to decide to blow the crap out of Riviera. Enter in our main characters Ein and Lada, 2 Grim Angels who are sent to carry out the task, and Rose, I guess, who is Ein's talking cat familiar. Ein is pretty hesitant to carry out the task since it involves massacring everyone who currently lives on the island. However, Lada says it's their mission and there's no point in questioning orders. After a confrontation with Ursula, Ein is separated from Lada and Rose and loses all of his memories. Ein then wakes up in a sprite village and is taken care of by the inhabitants. In a bid to repay his benefactors, he joins Lena and Fia as they investigate the first dungeon, after which Ein confronts Ursula once again and regains his memories. From this point on, Ein vows to try and find a way to prevent the Magi from nuking Riviera and the rest of his newfound friends. And that's pretty much the plot of the first Dept game in a nutshell. While I do classify Riviera as probably the safest game in the series, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for the series itself. To be completely honest, if the first Dept game was, say, Nights in the Nightmare, then we might not even have a series to talk about, since it would have been too strange for the general audience to latch onto. And it's only safe by the standards of the Dept series. Compared to normal JRPGs out there, there's still a ton of unique features that set Riviera apart from the others. While yes, the basic outline of the battle system is a turn-based battle, it's also an adventure game of sorts, chock full of so many secrets everywhere, and even sudden mini-games that reward you for succeeding and punish you for failing. The gameplay in Riviera conceptually is actually engaging, and is only undermined by two specific things which I'll get to in a bit. Riviera, in a nutshell, is a game about resource management, whether that be managing TP, which is required to navigate dungeons, managing what items to keep and what to drop with a very limited inventory space, or managing affection meters for the 4 different heroines. Essentially, every dungeon in the game consists of a ton of different rooms, and you can navigate these rooms by clicking one of your D-pad, up, down, left, right, depending on the room. You can also switch to interacting with objects in any room, with each room usually having 1 to 4 different things to interact with. How they made this system interesting or annoying, depending on how you look at it, is by making the exploration take a resource called TP. While running through the most basic route of a dungeon takes no TP, anytime you try to investigate an object or path that is shown in red, it takes 1 TP. The only way to increase this TP is by beating the crap out of monsters as efficiently as possible. Every dungeon has a limited number of battles, so you're always encouraged to try and finish every battle with a finisher move, as how fast and how stylish your final attack is are the greatest factors as to your ranking in battle. Speaking of which, while the base framework is a turn-based battle system, it does have plenty of unique points. For one, characters have no levels. Instead, stats and HP are all based on mastering equipment. This gains them access to a new finisher and, more importantly, increases their stats permanently. If you've played Romancing Saga or Final Fantasy II, all of this probably sounds real familiar to you, although Riviera is definitely way less obtuse about how it all works. Before battle starts, you can select up to 4 items to bring into battle, with all items and weapons having limited use and breaking after expending their durability. When factoring in how limited your inventory space is, the player is forced into this constant decision-making process of what weapons to use, what weapons to master, and what items to keep. Even if an item looks useless at first, it might turn out to be important for a secret story event later, but you only have a limited inventory space, so you can't keep all of them. You might want to stick with only your strongest weapons, but you have to master new ones to have any chance of leveling up. When you combine that with a limited number of battles and a rating system you want to do well on to get more TP, you have all of the ingredients for a really engaging battle system, theoretically. All of this is kind of undermined by 2 things. One, there's a practice tool which you can access at any time, with absolutely 0 drawbacks, where all items have infinite durability, so you can just master everything there, and all the permanent stats carry over to the main game with no penalties. The second is that, even if you didn't use the practice tool a single time throughout the entirety of Riviera, the game is easy enough that as long as you are actively trying to master all your equipment, you will get to the end of the game without any issue. The main character always having access to an infinite durability weapon that instantly increases your battle rating if you finish with it, kind of trivializes the battle rating system as well. And if all of that fails, if you ever lose a battle, you can just retry it with enemies starting with less HP the next time. You don't get penalized in any real way for doing so. Well, okay, technically it probably has an impact on your score, which I don't even know if that's true or not. But honestly, when it comes to scoring systems in single player games, I personally have never cared about them in any way unless I was getting some sort of reward for getting a high one. Like, who am I going to show off my score to? My dog? The game isn't terrible or anything. Everything I mentioned is still kind of fun. It's just not as engaging an experience as it could have been. A lot of the difficult choice making and inventory management is kind of dropped to the wayside when players have the leeway to just master everything during practice battles without worrying about defeat. There is never a need to worry about what weapons to keep, since once you master it, you can just dump it for the next best thing. Missed potential aside, there's still plenty I like about Riviera outside of the combat. Maybe it's my monkey brain, but I actually really love the idea of having mini-games in the middle of exploration. None of them are hard per se, but it keeps the players on their toes. Whenever it happens, it's always a fun little moment with some actual consequences. Stuff like timing puzzles, hitting the right combination of buttons within a time limit. It's always a great change of pace. None of these consequences are game-changing, of course, but they can reward items, permanent upgrades, or even key items related to secrets. Completing mini-games successfully also might just be for the sake of avoiding penalties as well. Some people might dislike this, but I was actually pleasantly surprised by just the sheer amount of secrets located inside Riviera. First time I played it, I was a wee picky child and I didn't worry about such things at all. It was only on my second playthrough onwards, when I was a tad bit older, that I was surprised at just how much of the game I technically missed. Granted, none of these things really have any ramifications on the main plot, but it did lead to a ton of missable scenes and affecting the world in small ways. It's also important for getting access to a ton of extras, most of which aren't important in any real way, but just think of it as a cute bonus. I think the only one players would be remotely interested in would be the extra chapter. The highlight of this extra chapter is not only the fact that you get one new endgame dungeon to mess around in, but also, aside from being able to pick all the main characters, you can team up with Lada again, which is normally only available in the prologue. This is new for the PSP remake actually, since in the original, the bonus chapter was originally just an extra boss with Hades without the dungeon, and you had to use the normal party. The rest of the extras are stuff like sound test, CG, item, face collection, all things that personally every time I see in a game like this, even when they're already unlocked, I usually skip them. Maybe I'll check out the soundtrack if it's banging, but even then I would just listen to it on YouTube or something. Still, I think the extra unlockables aren't really the reason to try and find these secrets, but rather for just seeing how each secret affects the world in tiny ways, such as getting the moondrop in the first dungeon, which allows the mermaid in the crystal caverns to slowly be able to talk more and more each time you visit throughout the rest of the game. Discovering each one of these sort of things are all kinda cute and help round out the world just that tad bit little more. The physical rewards such as a better weapon are nice too, but it's those little story beats that are much more interesting to see, especially since chances are you'll get an equally as good weapon in the next dungeon anyways. If you did want to get all the secrets though, the game makes that incredibly hard, since many of the secrets are either incredibly convoluted, or you can easily lock yourself out of one by using an item prematurely, or even getting an item that locks you out of one later. The game is a nightmare for completionists, which is going to be a running theme for the rest of the series, but for the vast majority of players, I think the secrets are just a cute little discovery you get to make every now and then. The music in Riviera is also pretty solid. In fact, it's probably one of the best features of the game. I believe Minako Adachi predominantly does the soundtrack for this game, which is going to be the opposite case for most of the later ones, but yeah, it's great. The music does a great job of setting the scene for all of the different locations the main characters will be going to. The battle themes gets your blood pumping, and most of all, they just all sound really fun. Again, I'm always bad at describing music, but I hope what you've been hearing in the background of this video will have given you a feel for the type of music that is in Riviera. I mentioned in the beginning that there was a dating sim sort of element to the game with the affection system for the four main heroines. It works pretty much how you would imagine it to, where every action in the game contributes to the hidden rating and you get a mini epilogue at the end, depending on whoever has the highest. While trying to balance all the decisions to get the heroine ending you want might sound like a hassle, in practice it's not too bad at all. Whoever you let finish the most battles already gets a ridiculous head start on affection points for that chapter, and there are enough obvious pointed decisions that you're given pretty much free reign to selectively increase or decrease someone's affection. As much as I'm glancing over the entire system, I can't deny the fact that when I was younger, the fact that the game even had an affection system of some sort was one of the reasons I was interested in playing it in the first place. The characters themselves are fine, they aren't anything too special, but I still enjoyed watching them blunder around the entire game. Chances are you'll like one of the girls at least a little bit, even if what you see is pretty much what you get. I think on my first playthrough, I was a big fan of Serene, the blue-haired scythe lady with wings. Riviera the Promised Land is what I can only describe as a perfectly decent JRPG with some interesting mechanics. I think there was room to make a much more engaging experience that would actually force players to utilize these mechanics, but the overall difficulty of the game would have to be tuned up. On the other hand, it's probably a lot more accessible for anyone to enjoy it the way it currently is now. Riviera is chill enough that anyone can get through it even with a bare basic understanding of the game, yet there are enough secrets and minigames to entertain the player as they run through each locale. As we move further down the series, we're going to see the Dept franchise venture into much more interesting places with more diverse mechanics, stories, characters, and even music. There's a lot to look forward to, but for now, if Riviera the Promised Land was the game that started the Dept series, then Yggdra Union was the one that gave it any chance of becoming a franchise. It's the first game in the franchise to really embody everything that makes the Dept franchise unique. It has gameplay that I honestly haven't seen done in any game aside from Yggdra Union. It has a banging soundtrack that blows Riveria's out of the water. and also has a unique designation of being one of the hardest games to ever come out on the Game Boy Advance. There is a reason why out of all the games in the Dept Heaven franchise, Yggdra Union is the only one to receive a number of spin-offs in the form of Blaze Union, a Japanese-only prequel, Yggdra Unison, a mobile fan-disc game which I didn't play, and Gloria Union, which borrows the same mechanics but in an entirely different setting. More importantly than any of that, however, is the plain fact that Yggdra Union is a really well-made tactics game. It isn't afraid to throw the player into the dirt and expect them to figure out how it all works, or potentially wind up in a dead-end situation which might be impossible to recover from. If secrets were something that you really enjoyed in Riviera, then Yggdra Union has way more of them, and ones with much more important rewards, that the players desperately desire because they really do need every bit of help they can possibly get. To top it all off, the story is also leagues ahead of the previous one as well, detailing a serious war drama that clashes really well with the cute SD art style all the characters have. It tells a surprisingly nuanced war story where Yggdra and Millenor fight back against the Empire, but unfortunately stakes are high on either side, and war is a far dirtier affair than just a simple good versus bad. Justice lies with the Holy Sword, but does it truly? Yggdra Union came out in 2006 on the Game Boy Advance. It then got a PSP remake only 2 years later in 2008, which is what we will be focusing on today. A Switch release of all things came out in 2020, but that's Japanese only, and honestly from what I can tell, is pretty much a port of the PSP version. News of the Switch release was probably what prompted me to start this whole retrospective in the first place, as it reminded me of this franchise that I never got around to finishing until somewhat recently. If we're talking about English versions, the PSP version of Yggdra Union is easily the best version with one minor caveat. Just like with Riviera, the PSP version has smoother graphics, a much cleaner soundtrack, which is great since the music is ridiculously good, voice acting for every character, and even a whole nother ending and chapter to experience, alongside a bunch of other additions strewn throughout the game like more characters, cards, side chapters. The only real big downside to playing the PSP version is that the game's difficulty has been toned down quite a bit. There is a hard mode which is basically the same difficulty as the original Game Boy Advance game, but you can't access it without having beaten the game already, which I'm never really a fan of. Difficulty should exist for the sake of giving the player a tailored experience that really maximizes the amount of fun the player can get from their playthrough, whether that be through challenging them or getting them to see more of the story. So what's the point of withholding this option from the player? Sure, maybe if it's a ridiculous one-hit challenge mode that's meant more as a sick joke than anything. Otherwise, it might as well be available from the beginning. Especially since when it comes to more obscure remakes like this, a good portion of your player base is gonna be returnees who are playing the game in order to see what's new, while experiencing a game they already loved. To add insult to injury, the new hidden ending, added exclusively for the PSP remake of Yggdra Union, is only available in hard mode, which itself is only available after having beaten the game once. As I am coming from the Game Boy Advance version, I just found an already completed save file online, so I could just go straight into it. While I do think the game's original difficulty was pretty balanced, I do recommend trying it out on hard first, and if you think it's too difficult, go ahead and restart on normal. The only big things you'll miss is one character you'll probably never use, and the extra ending, which is just one more chapter added at the end of the game. As mentioned earlier, Yggdra Union follows the harrowing tale of the eponymous heroine Yggdra, the Princess of Phantasynia, who starts off the story by fleeing away from her home, which has been completely destroyed by the Empire led by Emperor Gokasa. Her choice in hiding from the pursuing soldiers in a bandit hideout ends up with the bandit leader, Silver Wolf Millenor, coming into confrontation with the Empire's pursuit force led by Aegina. After driving them away, Yggdra and Millenor meet, and thus begins a deal between the two that will lead to the revival of the royal army and a crusade to take down Emperor Gokasa and revive Phantasynia. If there's one thing about Yggdra Union's story that is surprising, it's how it treats the subject of war between nations with a more nuanced look than good guys beating up the evil big bad empire. Considering that the basic standard is like Fire Emblem 7, where all the bad guys are super ugly people who relish in pillaging villages, it's nice to see them try and show a more human side to the Empire. Yggdra Union dives into the idea that the main characters aren't necessarily the good guys, even if they are on the losing side. I really do like how this theme is presented from the beginning of the game all the way till the end, even if it is a little in your face at certain points. It does a great job of twisting the idea of justice and what it means for both sides. While you don't learn a great deal about the dragon generals that make up Gokasa's main army, you do understand their faith in Emperor Gokasa stretches beyond that of a simple vassal. For them, Emperor Gokasa is basically the same as Yggdra and Millenor, and just like how this war acts as a life and death situation for Fantasynia, they too have equally high stakes for the Bronchian Empire. As Yggdra and Millenor force their way through the Empire, the people who stand in their way aren't necessarily ruthless murderers, but rather others who are forced into the fight because of their own circumstances, all of whom are nonetheless cut down in order for the royal army to remain victorious. While you do get a decently sized cast to join your party, the main characters for Yggdra Union are clearly the eponymous Yggdra, Princess of Fantasynia, and the one with the highest stake in this war, and Millenor the Silver Wolf, a bandit leader who's initially in it just for the rewards, but ends up becoming the second in command for the royal army. Both of these protagonists do an amazing job of balancing each other out. Yggdra as a naive but hopeful princess who fights for what she believes in, and Millenor the realist mood maker who keeps the army together, and more importantly, acts as the voice of reason in guiding Yggdra's decisions. Millenor is the one that backs Yggdra on all her choices when she's constantly worried about whether she should or shouldn't, and is also the one to bring the army back from the brink when they are at their worst. They play really well off of each other, with Yggdra as the main one to grow from the beginning as a naive princess towards the end of the game as a capable leader, and Millenor as her guiding light up until she can come into her own. This is also reflected even gameplay-wise, where Millenor is stronger than Yggdra in the beginning, but Yggdra, if trained properly, will eventually outstrip him by the end. Millenor is also kind of like a Mega Chad, so even without Yggdra, he's pretty dang likable. He just isn't solo main character material since he doesn't grow nearly as much as Yggdra does throughout this journey. Somehow, I managed to make it this far without talking about the gameplay, which is funny because gameplay is definitely what Yggdra Union excels at first and foremost. It is one of the most unique strategy games I've had the pleasure of playing, with a difficulty that I think is tough, but pretty dang fair at the same time. In the Riviera video, I said Riviera was a game about resource management. Well, Yggdra Union takes that concept and turns it up to 11. While you still have the standard enemy turn and your turn tactics system, just about everything else is different. I'd go as far as to say that it might be a little too overwhelming for most players upon starting the game, but for those willing to stick with it lies a fun and challenging experience up until the end. The base concept of Yggdra Union is a turn-based strategy RPG. What separates it from all the others, however, is two things. One is the card system, where essentially every battle you select a number of cards which serve both as your movement options as well as your attack options. The second is that while you can move your characters as much as you want depending entirely on the movement value of each card, both you and the enemy can only attack once per turn, with additional attacks depending on the positioning of both yourself and the enemy's position. Basically, one battle per turn with how many people participating in that one battle, depending entirely on how the player sets up the board. You stack all of this together with a ton of conditionals like how certain units are overwhelmingly stronger in certain areas, weaker in others, a weapon triangle, trying to predict how the enemy will engage your units on their turn, and you have a strategy game that really makes you think every turn out. Even battles themselves aren't just a numbers game, but rather, you're given control whether to go passive or aggressive, with passive allowing you to build up charge until you can unleash your superpowers, and aggressive doing more damage and applying an element effect on your weapon. Stages themselves are limited not just by the increased MVP permanent stat bonus if you beat the stage fast enough, but also by the amount of cards you can bring to battle, as once you run out of cards, you instantly game over as you can't move anymore, and also by the fact that all characters have HP, or morale as it's called. The fun thing about morale in Yggdra Union is the fact that it does not recover between stages, so everyone takes permanent damage every battle, with the only way to recover it by sacrificing items for morale recovery, items which all have their own special uses or powerful buffs, and aren't that easy to find, especially for first-time players. The biggest difference between the GBA difficulty and the PSP normal difficulty is the fact that the PSP normal mode makes this part way easier as characters gain 25% of their max morale upon leveling up. So you don't have to struggle quite as much in trying to constantly sacrifice items for your army. While characters can't die technically, only if Yggdra or Millenor ever run out of morale is it an instant game over, The penalty of other characters losing all their EXP and coming back with 1 morale is incredibly bad still, and will force you to spend a ton of items bringing them back up to full. There are just a ton of options in what you bring to every battlefield, and how you decide to tackle it. Even what specific cards the player brings to every battle is entirely up to them. You can't just bring all the high movement cards because you still want to use the cards with the best super effects, but you also can't just bring your strongest cards since you need movement to actually move your army. While units have their own level ups that affect their stats, cards themselves also power up with every battle they are used in, so you have to try and level the weaker cards that might become more useful later. To top all of this off is the fact that every item in Yggdra Union has a durability limit of sorts, where they can be equipped on a character for a certain amount of battles before they disappear forever. These items can grant anything from basic stat buffs to special effects such as complete nullification to ice attacks, which makes that character pretty much immune to an army of Undines by themselves. What I think is super interesting, however, is the fact that you can't overwrite any of these equipments. So if an item, say, is there for 4 battles, once you put it on that character, it's stuck on that character until 4 stages are over. I know me just saying this probably scares everyone to never using any of their items in fear that they will use them incorrectly or they will equip something and be stuck with it for far too long, but I think that's kind of the magic of Yggdra Union. There is a cost and reward to nearly every facet of the game, whether that be through morale loss, card EXP, character EXP, item gains, equipping items, and so forth. Players can minimize the downsides and maximize the upsides by understanding different systems and capitalizing on them. It's a game that goes, yeah, Yggdra Union is hard. You have all these items that you fought tooth and nail to collect, whether through secrets, stealing, or most likely both, so you better dang well use them. Speaking of which, you know how Riviera has a bunch of little secrets which are fun to discover? Well, Yggdra Union has way more of that, all of which are made more enticing by the fact that all of them are useful. Even if the inbuilt effect of the equipment isn't the greatest, it can still be used as morale for your army that is constantly in dire need of it. Characters are all pretty useful in Yggdra Union for the most part. I won't say they are balanced, but they all have their own specific specialties and roles, especially considering the fact that many of the skills in the game can only be used by characters wielding a specific weapon type. The only ones I'll particularly shout out are Yggdra, of course, since she's the main character and needs training early on to really shine later in the game, Millenor, since he's the other main character and is equally as important, and finally there's also Misso the Tactician, who's a new addition for the PSP version, and comes with the absolute BS weapon called the Scythe. You know how I know the Scythe is one of the greatest weapons in the game? Because that's Gokasa's main weapon, and that man is absolutely bonkers broken. One of the greatest parts of Yggdra Union is the fact that the stages and overall difficulty of the game are crafted expertly in order to make the players engage with their systems. If a player doesn't make use of effects such as bridge buffs to knights, or how Yggdra starts with an item that grants her counter for a few stages, chances are they're probably gonna have trouble finishing the game. Granted, I think Yggdra Union's difficulty comes less from a place of the game itself being really hard, but rather the fact that there are several factors which the game expects the player to take full advantage of. And if they don't, then yeah, battles can seem kind of ridiculous. The game does a pretty good job of explaining everything as well, something which the next game in the Dept series doesn't do nearly as well. Finally, I think Yggdra Union's presentation is probably the biggest upgrade from Riviera, and I mean that in pretty much every department. Yggdra Union is a game that, even in present times, I think still looks great. The actual battles of the game feel incredibly fun to play through and watch, from the beginning, when you watch your army jump onto the opposing army, to the actual back and forth as you try to choose between going aggressive and passive. The big sprites do a great job of letting the players get a good look at them, and they also serve a practical purpose in helping players gauge roughly how much HP both armies have left. By not being able to see exactly but only roughly how much HP each army has, it allows for quite a bit of skill expression as players eventually start to figure out how battles will go just from looking at the stats, weapon type, element, environment, and a whole bunch of other things. Music is absolutely baller as well. It probably helps that somehow every single character in the game has their own unique battle theme, and they're all pretty dang decent. Major shoutouts to both of the main character themes especially. The voice work is also better than Riviera's, which isn't saying much considering how I felt about that one, but yeah, Millenor and Yggdra both sound great. While I listened to both the Japanese and English voice acting, I stuck with the Japanese for most of the way, and I thought they did a perfectly decent job, considering especially just how much the main characters talk throughout the game. Yggdra Union is a game about cost. From a story perspective, it asks the question of what exactly is justice, and how much is this war between Fantasynia and the Empire going to cost for both sides. From a gameplay perspective, every single moment in the game is a constant battle of resources, where the player's resources will constantly dwindle with every fight, with the main goal for the player being to try and minimize these costs while maximizing the rewards. It's a game with a ton of depth, and one that expects the player to figure all the stuff out and use it to their advantage in order to reach the end. It's a game that rewards careful planning and thinking on every turn. While yes, there are some hidden items which are kind of complete nonsense to find, there are also plenty of secrets that the game does give ample hints towards, and even without some of the best items out there, the game is still perfectly beatable from beginning to end. It tells a surprisingly nuanced war story that you wouldn't expect from such a game, especially one with such a cute SD art style. I haven't gotten around to tackling Yggdra Union, but if anyone's interested in hearing about that game, I might talk about it after I beat it and after I go through the last 2 games in the Dept series. We've only got 2 more to go through, and the next one is a banger. Some might even consider it to be a better game than Yggdra Union. As for my opinions on it, all I will say is that if you thought that Yggdra Union was a little obtuse and complicated, you ain't seen nothing yet. If I were to try and say which Dept entry was the best game in the franchise, well, you probably already know that my answer to that is Yggdra Union if you checked the previous video in this retrospective. However, if I were to change that to what I think is the most unique game in the Dept franchise, actually, scratch that, one of the most unique games I've ever played, that would be Nights in the Nightmare, hands down. The best way I can describe Nights in the Nightmare is that it's a strategic bullet hell. Sounds immediately weird, right? Making use of the DS touchscreen as that's the platform it came out on, it's not really a tactics game, it's not a shump at all either, but somehow it's something in between the two. They combined a constantly dwindling resource grind and time positioning, alongside dodging a constant hail of bullets. Where Nights in the Nightmare shines even beyond the fact that it's probably one of the most unique games ever created, is that the atmosphere of the game is brilliant. The strangeness of the gameplay, combined with the somber, almost fairy tale-like setup to the story, leads to a pretty special experience. The story is simultaneously one of the most interesting in the franchise, while also being the most non-linear one. Honestly, if Nights in the Nightmare didn't have a whole lot of annoying parts to it, I'd probably consider it my favorite out of the 4. As it stands, I think the game is just a tad bit too unfriendly to new players for me to wholeheartedly love it. There's a lot to talk about and a learning curve that might as well be a cliff, so let's just get straight into it. Nights in the Nightmare is episode 4 of the Dept franchise. Even though it's the 3rd game to come out, as episode 3 was originally supposed to be a PC MMORPG that got announced in 2008 and silently disappeared from the world after that. In truth though, a PC MMORPG sounds like an absolutely awful idea in 2008, especially because Sting would be making it, and MMORPGs are pretty notorious for needing pretty big budgets and big teams to get running, both of which Sting was not. Instead of that, Nights in the Nightmare came out in 2008 on the Nintendo DS. It later got ported to the PlayStation Portable in 2010, but unlike what I've said for every game up until now, it's pretty clear that this game was designed from the ground up to be played on the DS. Like many DS games, Nights in the Nightmare incorporates touchscreen controls into the mechanics of the gameplay. But unlike most games on the DS, these touch controls aren't just some nonsense gimmick that was slapped on last second like, say, Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow, but rather it was a part of the core mechanic of the game. While this could be considered a strategy game, a more accurate term would be a strategic bullet hell, and you can probably imagine how important the touchscreen functions are when you are using them to dodge a million bullets on the screen while activating attacks and skills. I bring this all up because I really want to stress the importance of the touchscreen in Nights in the Nightmare. Then I want to say that while I played the original DS version, I completed the game on PSP, which is where all this footage comes from. The PSP version has better graphics, a slightly more refined soundtrack, and an extra scenario where you get to play as Yggdra because, sure, why not? The DS version has better integration of the central bullet hell mechanic because moving the Wisp with the stylus is way easier than trying to move around with the PSP's terrible thumbstick. There is a Switch version, but just like with the Yggdra Union, it's Japanese only, and probably is just a port of the PSP version, so I'm not gonna talk about that. Personally, I think the DS version plays better, but I checked out the PSP version because the screen was way bigger, and I wanted to see if it was still playable even without the stylus. And I can safely say that the PSP version was a fun time, even with a slightly more janky control system. I wanted to initially say that Nights into Nightmare is the weirdest game I've ever played, but honestly I've played a lot of absolute nonsense, so I can't actually say that. What I can say, however, is that it's one of the most interesting games I've ever experienced, and is definitely the weirdest one out of the Dept franchise. It's hard to describe, but as you've already seen, I've taken to calling it a strategic bullet hell, so let's break down what that actually means. For the strategic portion, the basic gameplay consists of the preparation phase and battle phase. During preparation before each battle is where you deal with leveling up units, combining weapons, transowing, or enhancing weapons. Each unit is only able to attack and utilize special skills with one weapon type, and every unit has vitality, which is depleted with every single attack, skill usage, getting hit, or literally everything involved with sending them into battle. When it runs out, they're dead permanently. The only way to raise vitality is by leveling them up, which does have a cap that's decided by their max level, and Transo, which involves sacrificing one knight in order to increase the vitality and max level of another. As for the bullet hell section, every stage in the game is essentially a battle where you select your unit's amount depending on the stage, and what 4 weapons and items you bring to that turn of the battle. The only items in the game, aside from weapons, are key items found during battle through breaking objects and other secrets, and are used to recruit all the knights you come across throughout every stage of the game, or to weaken bosses or trade for better items. Every key item only corresponds to one single character, and are otherwise useful only for dismantling. Each turn of the battle is a 60-second session where you attempt to break objects and defeat as many enemies as you can during the time limit. The bullet hell part comes from how you control the wisps during the battle, where in order to use your weapons and items, you have to drag each one from the corner of the screen onto the unit you want to use it on, all the while dodging the hail of bullets coming from the enemies on screen. On DS, you get to control the wisps using a stylus, which feels a lot more natural, while on the PSP version, it's a tad stiffer using the analog stick, which is famous for being terrible. The difference here isn't too bad, but once you start getting to stuff like launches, element changing, additional damage, gear jamming, all of which requires wisp movement, it does kind of make you miss the stylus a little more if you're playing on the PSP version. Positioning and knowing what units and weapons to bring is insanely important to winning any fight, as every weapon type has its own unique hit patterns, and figure out enemy movement patterns so that you can select the appropriate attacks to maximize damage while minimizing uses to conserve vitality is what separates the good players from the bad. Every hit taken by the wisp while you're in the process of moving items and charging attacks reduces time on a 60-second timer, and once you reach 0, that turn ends. And a new one begins where you can then change your units and items. This back and forth continues onwards until you make a row or column on the diagonal line on the matrix, which ends the stage. Obviously, I've glossed over quite a few things in this explanation. Stuff like fog, MP, what is a matrix, effects, elements, chaos and law phases, what goes into upgrading weapons, but I want to give a basic rundown while pointing out one of the biggest issues with Nights into Nightmare. The Dept franchise in general is famous for having their systems be overly convoluted. I think most of the games are actually really fun and interesting, but I also think they sometimes don't do the greatest job explaining many of these mechanics. In Riviera, this wasn't a problem because that game is easy. In Yggdra Union, it wasn't bad because although there was a lot to learn, they also had solid tutorials all the way till the end of the game that point out whenever a new mechanic is introduced. Nights into Nightmare is simultaneously the most out there game in the franchise, while also having the most janky tutorial. You'll notice one thing very quickly upon clicking the teachings buttons on the title screen, and that's the fact that it's really long. There are a ton of tutorials on all the little different features in the game, and going through every single one would take like 40 minutes, which I think is both intimidating and a little much for someone who hasn't even started the game yet. When you start a new playthrough, the game does ask you if you want to go through at least the most basic of tutorials, which sounds fine, except like most Dept games, you probably do want to know about everything to effectively play, otherwise you'll probably have trouble beating the game. The good ones, like the tutorial missions, which actually check to make sure you know what you're doing, are entirely optional, which seems a little weird. Most of the other tutorials are just giant info dumps, although this might come from the fact that supposedly the North American DS version had tutorials added onto it to make the game easier to understand, which might be why it's separated like this. Nights into Nightmare is a game that is quite a bit strange compared to the usual games that people are used to, and the fact that the tutorial comes in a giant text dump probably doesn't help anyone. What is probably more annoying than that, however, is how some of the secrets in the game are found. Most of the key items are pretty easy for the most part, as they mostly appear due to breaking an object or terrain on the field. What I think is dumb are the key items that only appear after an object respawns, which means that if you're out there trying to get all of them, you have to spend time just skipping turns, waiting for them to respawn after breaking all of them once. Granted, none of the recruit key items in the game are hidden inside the respawnable ones, only the tradable ones for powerful items, or the ones for weakening bosses are usually hidden in them, but here's the thing. That fact isn't something you would know about this game, unless you looked up a walkthrough. For most people, once they discover that an object respawns and has more key items, they would then end up trying to wait for 4 more turns after destroying every object for every subsequent battle, so that they don't end up missing any key items. In the end, I think trying to go for these respawnable items makes the game feel way worse than it needs to, and while in hindsight, the fact that there's no recruitable key items means that most players shouldn't bother to go after them in the first place, isn't something that player would know at all unless they consulted a walkthrough. What's worse than all of this though, is the requirements for getting the good ending of the game. So Nights in a Nightmare has technically about 12 endings if we're trying to be all fancy about it, but assuming we only play the game once, it has 4 including the bad one where we just straight lose. The big requirement for all of the good endings is recruiting and keeping Algiri all the way till the end, as she's important story-wise, as well as attaining the Encardia. What I want to focus on here is the latter requirement. The Encardia is Marietta's staff, and is hidden in a secret dungeon. In order to access that secret dungeon on stage 23, we have to know somehow that there is a secret spot that is breakable on this map. Specifically, this unassuming square that is on a slightly lower elevation than everything else, which is something you'd probably only find out by accident while trying to whack this bottom enemy. The biggest reason why it's so unassuming, however, is because this is probably the only hidden spot in the entire game. Every other breakable object tends to be pretty visible. We also then have to hit it as many times as it takes to break it, which is like 26 hits or some nonsense, and then it will give 1 item. Not only that, we are then supposed to know that we have to keep on hitting it until it breaks a second time, which then opens up the secret to chapter 23.5. The only real hint to all of this? The mysteriously long 23 turn limit we are given in this chapter. How you are supposed to discover this organically without any outside help is beyond me. This is ridiculous, and the fact that it's vital for the good end of the game is insane to me. What's even crazier is that during the secret chapter, the weapon you need is hidden in one of these chests randomly, which is bad because the player doesn't know that they are looking for this weapon in the first place, and all this boss is trying to do is destroy these chests permanently so that the player can't get the item. I could totally see a world where a new player who's playing Nights in a Nightmare completely blind somehow gets to this secret stage and then ends up defeating the boss without picking up the Encardia because it happened to be in the first box that the boss destroyed, thereby locking him out of the good ending for that entire playthrough. Algiri at least makes a ton of sense and only requires 1 key item near the end of the game, unlike the madness that is Encardia. Now, even though I've spent the last 5-ish minutes complaining about the tutorials, hidden key items, and the secret good ending, you've probably realized that I haven't really been saying much about the gameplay itself. And that's because I actually do really like how Nights in a Nightmare does it. I think the combination of bullet hell dodging with their unique blend of tactical gameplay works really well, with a frantic pace of trying to balance between when to dodge bullets and when to go for the perfect hit is a fun dynamic. All the little additional things like spinning the jamming gears to stun enemies who are about to use their ultra move, mixing and matching the right elements, thinking of what weapons to bring after realizing how each enemy moves, using the unique abilities of cavalry and duelists to actually move your knights, then swap to another class for the perfect positioning. All of that is really fun and engaging, and that's the stuff I love about Nights in Nightmare. Most of the issues I see with the game come from outside the main gameplay loop. If you do ignore all the respawnable objects though, the game flows a lot better. At its core, it's a great game, it just does a bad job of selling itself and explaining what's going on, which is doubly bad for Nights in a Nightmare because of how weird it is already. Having a secret to unlocking your game's good ending is completely fine. In fact, I do like that sort of thing. It's just that you also need to have some sort of way for your player to understand how to get the good ending. Offer some sort of a hint as to its existence, as having a turn limit that happens to be higher than the rest of the game, it's still too vague. As I always say in every entry in the series, music is solid. I don't have too much to say about it. Hopefully what you've been hearing in the background is enough for it to speak for itself. I will at least give special shoutouts to The Spoke, a haunting melody which accompanies the beginning of every stage and really sets the mood for the entire game as a whole. It's very unassuming, it's not bombastic, not rock out awesome, but if I had to pick what I think best represented Nights in the Nightmare, that would be the song I pick out. Somehow we've gotten this far without me mentioning the story at all, which is a first for the series, and that's because I think, surprisingly enough, Nights in the Nightmare's greatest strength is not the strange gameplay that is most known for, but rather the atmosphere that comes with everything about it. From the strange, almost fairy tale-like story involving the redemption of a Valkyrie and the plight of a ruined kingdom, the melancholic music that accompanies the start of every stage, paired with a narration that preludes every battle with an almost somber tone, the unique gameplay that involves using the souls of fallen soldiers, all of this combines into what is almost an ethereal feel to the entire story. I think the approach to telling the story in both the past and present is a really cool idea. While we are currently playing as the Wisp traversing through the lands of his ruined kingdom, we simultaneously are also learning about what happened to the knights who used to live in this kingdom, and what exactly has led everything to this point. Nights in the Nightmare is a non-linear tale, not just in the way the story is presented both in past and present, but also how characters are portrayed. Many of the knights all have different relationships to one another, even down to what each knighthood represents, but finding out about all of that is entirely up to the player's discretion through listening to their conversations and trying out different combinations during specific battles. There are so many unique pieces of dialogue that only come about through trial and error, and piecing all those little relationships through them is quite enjoyable in of itself. While it's easy to see them as disposable, as many of the knights only appear for like 1 or 2 events and then quickly perish right after, even the very nature of the game's transsoul function requires you to sacrifice one knight's soul for another. However, despite all of that, finding reasons to care about each individual knight and discovering what little stories each one has still manages to be a very endearing part of the story. I really respect how somber Nights in the Nightmare is. This isn't the triumphant tale where the recently deceased king returns to lead his people back to victory, but rather it's a story of a lost soul, one who has returned to rectify the mistakes that has led his kingdom to fall. He isn't here to revive what has been lost, but rather to stop further destruction from consuming the rest of the world. It's pretty clear after seeing what has happened that even if he managed to stop the evil that he has been fated to do from the beginning, his kingdom will still remain ruined, and all the people he's lost will probably never come back. When a knight joins the team, they would have only been able to do so because they too have perished. Many of the characters face ultimately cruel ends, and this extends even beyond the knights who join our party. There are others, such as the Prince of the Kingdom, who has turned into a werewolf which we must defeat early on. This particular fact of his origin isn't something we are told directly about, but it rather is something which we can infer from the events we see in the story. I do like how much of the background for the story is left entirely up to the player to discover, or completely ignore if they don't really care about it. I won't spoil what exactly happens, but I will say that I really respect the direction the game takes all the way until the good ending. What's also nice is that aside from unlocking hard mode after beating the game, you also unlock 2 additional routes which change up the story. This fact alone offers a good reason to try a higher difficulty alongside these new routes. Hard mode is entirely worth doing as the game is decently challenging on normal, but I think it probably shines even more on hard mode, especially after you're acclimated to how the game works. The original game only added the blue Melia route, but the PSP version also has the Yggdra route, which is probably going to be a tad bit more lighthearted, considering the first few early chapters I saw. Melia's route has more unique knights not present in the original Maria route, and even some different bosses. Yggdra's route, no idea personally, as I only started a few of the early chapters, although I heard that it's basically the same as Maria's route for all intents and purposes. Nights in the Nightmare is truly something special, from the gameplay to the melancholic story, and the only reason why I think it's not considered quite as highly as Yggdra Union is the fact that it's held back by not really having a good enough tutorial to back up the very different gameplay that most people aren't used to. That's not to say the information isn't there, but rather it's just not explained in a very enticing way. A big text dump with pictures just isn't really the way to go, and as much fun as it is to watch Yggdra be all cute when explaining, that still doesn't make retaining that information any easier. Combine that with a couple of aggravating mechanics like hidden key items and respawning objects, and it makes for a slightly frustrating experience. I think past those annoyances, however, lies a pretty compelling narrative accompanied by an incredibly unique experience. It tells a very dark story that is covered by the art and obfuscated by the way the story is portrayed. It's a game like no other, and ultimately, isn't that really what the Dept franchise is all about? If you have anything you'd like to say about Nights in the Nightmare, your own experience with it, the frustrations that you had, your favorite night maybe, feel free to share that down in the comments below. Well, we made it. We have finally reached the last entry in the Dept franchise. The last episode, episode 9, because Shinichi Ito is an absolute madman. Gungnir, Inferno of the Demon Lance, and War of Heroes, which is an insanely long title that no one calls it by, is the last official game in the Dept mainline series. It's a game that pretty much had everything going against it. It was released super late in the PSP's life cycle. It came out in 2011, which is not only 7 years after the initial release of the console itself, but also only 5 months before Sony was set to release their brand new console, the PS Vita. This situation was even worse in North America, as it came out on June 12, 2012, 4 months after the PS Vita was released, and I'm not even going to mention the PAL region since they got that even later. If that wasn't enough, Gungnir somehow manages to be the most normal looking out of the 4 at first, but is probably the most difficult game to truly comprehend. So it's no surprise that considering all these factors, Gungnir was practically dead on arrival. For those who've played the game though, they know that what lies underneath is a truly fascinating spin on a tried and true tactics formula. I can safely say that Gungnir is the most unique tactics game I've ever played. It's the only tactics game I can think of where you and the enemy are playing by fundamentally different rules, one that eschews many traditional ways of thinking that we tend to have when it comes to these types of games. While I do still think the story in Nights in the Nightmare is certainly told in a much more interesting way, Gungnir is probably the most conventionally compelling tale, even if I do have some reservations about it, which I'll get into. If Yggdra Union was a surprisingly nuanced story about war, then Gungnir takes that concept and goes way harder into it. It's a story of discrimination, of misunderstood intentions, and ultimately is a very human tale from beginning to end. Gungnir tells the story of Giulio Rago, a youth born in the peasant district of Espada. While there is probably a greater world out there, the entire setting takes place in the Empire of Gargandia, in the year 983. The nation is home to 2 distinct classes, the noble Daltania and the accursed Leonica. Exactly when this discrimination began to occur is left intentionally vague, but by the current year, it's basically become a fact that everyone in the Empire knows about. In order to further segregate the 2 races, the Leonicans are all stuck in the slum district of Espada. Because of this, and plenty of atrocities that have occurred like the Espada massacre, the Leonica and some of the Daltania sympathetic to the cause have joined together to form the resistance group known as Esperanza. Unfortunately, they are completely outmatched by the far superior Imperial Army forces. 15 years after the birth of Esperanza and the death of Ricardo, Giulio's father, Giulio is about to be killed in a desperate battle when the demonic lance known as Gungnir falls onto the battlefield, giving the resistance a chance to prevail against overwhelming odds, pushing Giulio into the spotlight and forcing the wheels of destiny to start turning. It's pretty clear that with every subsequent game in the Dept franchise, the storyline has somehow managed to get darker and darker with every entry into the series, and I think Gungnir stands at the tail end of that. It isn't as bleak as Nights of the Nightmare, as that plays out more like the aftermath of a tragedy, while Gungnir is entirely in the process of one. The ultimate resolution for Giulio and Alyssa's journey, no matter whichever path you end up in, is one constantly full of danger and one that has no easy answers. I mentioned this earlier, but if Yggdra Union asks a question about what does war mean for 2 opposing nations, then Gungnir goes deeper and asks, why does distortion exist among communities, and why do people end up discriminating against those that are just like them? Even though the crux of the story is a downtrodden populace rebelling against the evil nobles, the circumstances surrounding this conflict pose both sides into much murkier waters. While the Gungnir in essence plays a similar role to Yggdra's Grand Centurio, as they both act as the rallying cry for their armies, as well as a symbol of hope for the fight, I think Gungnir's integration to both the story and gameplay is far more effective. The Inferno, or war gods that are wielded by Giulio, is such a cool concept. The fact that this power is explicitly not a force of good or justice, but rather pure power, and how it indiscriminately wrecks everyone on the battlefield. It's only from Giulio and Esperanza's point of view that Gungnir looks like a weapon of justice, while in the enemies and the player's eyes, it's clearly an evil, life-sucking scythe. Even with this weapon in hand though, Giulio, Alyssa's, and Esperanza's conflict against the Empire is still really one-sided all the way till the end. Speaking of which, let's run over our main characters. The protagonists for the story of Gungnir are Giulio Reggio, son of Riccardo Rago, the previous leader of Esperanza, Alyssa, a noble child picked up by Giulio near the beginning, Ragnus Rego, a Daltan, adopted child of Riccardo and the current leader of Esperanza, Elise, a Valkyrie from Asgard who's only there to help Giulio as he's a wielder of Gungnir, and finally Paolo, the kind, wise old man who acts as a surrogate father to the 3 Rego children. While at first it sounds similar to the setup for Yggdra Union, the noble Alyssa teams up with the ruffian Giulio, the story is way different. The main character role isn't just shared between the 2 leads, but rather between the 4 leaders, Ragnus, Paolo, Giulio, and Alyssa. The most important relationship truthfully is between Giulio and Ragnus, the 2 brothers who aren't connected by blood, but rather by family. I won't get into too much detail here as that would reveal too much, but I will have a spoiler section at the end of this to talk about my in-depth thoughts on the full story of Gungnir, as well as the direction Shinichi Ito ends up taking with the game, as it's fairly impossible for me to talk on any sort of level without spoilers. What I will say is that despite the things revealed in the developer interview, which I'll get into, I still think the end product of Gungnir tells a story that might not be conventionally fulfilling, but one that stays true to the themes Gungnir wants to convey. The relationships between each of the characters are fairly fleshed out, yet still obfuscated by how the game chooses to present its narrative. You truly do feel the desperate struggle that faces Giulio and the rest of Esperanza. As much as I enjoyed Gungnir's story, the gameplay is where this game truly shines. Gungnir manages to somehow be the most normal looking out of the 4 Dept games, yet is actually the most complicated and nuanced one out of the lot. Yes, it's a tactics game and has all the hallmarks of one, where you control units on a grid in a turn-based combat, with elevation, back attacks, side attacks, but pretty much everything else is different. It's a game that truly puts the word tactics to the test. In Gungnir, smart gameplay triumphs over any sort of grinding or farming, as while there are levels in the game, they don't nearly make as much of an impact as equipping the right weapons and characters for the right situations. As with most Dept games, there are a ton of different factors to juggle when it comes to combat, and while I won't be going over all of them, I'll try to hit the big ones so you can get a good idea of just how unique Gungnir truly is. Probably the most obvious difference compared to most tactics games is that fundamentally, the players and the enemies are playing on different rules. While the enemies get the classic tactics treatment where all the units have separate turns that are dependent on their speed, all of the player units share a single turn. Abilities still have cooldowns, with bigger abilities of course having bigger cooldowns, and forcing a character to move when they aren't ready yet penalizes that unit's max HP for that battle, and even subsequent battles which can only be healed by not using them or by using special items. It's such an interesting concept that really changes how players tackle every battlefield. You can't just move all the units up like in a normal tactics game, as you won't have enough time to maneuver all your units and react to coming situations. A well-placed AoE is actually a huge threat, as trying to move all the characters out of the way is pretty much impossible before it goes off. It also makes the fact that you are massively outnumbered in every battle all the more pressing, as it's quite easy for enemies to overwhelm your comparatively lower amount of units. Just this one difference alone changes the entire landscape of the battle. Combine that with the fact that there is instant death all around the corner, such as units getting pushed off the map, drowning in a river, thrown off a cliff, and every move in Gungnir becomes just that much more important. Even equipping units in Gungnir is a whole nother ordeal. It isn't just about putting whatever has the highest stats, but rather choosing items for the build you want to go for. Gungnir is a ridiculously powerful weapon, but it also weighs an absolute ton, and if you field Giulio with it every battle, he won't be able to do much of anything in most fights. Every piece of equipment has a different weight limit, but it's also not just about trying to fit in as much as possible before you reach the 100% limit, as the more weight you have, the more time it takes for your character to make another action without penalty. Balancing all of these positive and negative factors when it comes to outfitting your units really forces players to sit down and think how to outfit each character for each particular battle. And I haven't even begun to talk about elemental and specialty affinities, tactic buffs, counter boots, and all of that nonsense. What's also cool is that while each character has their own class, you can really drastically change the build of each character just by swapping in and out weapons and armors, so you are free to alter most characters completely at will without having to waste too much time building them back up again. While you could stick with the story characters as the game gives you just enough space to field most of them in every battle, you also free to completely ignore them and just recruit a ton of generics and play the entire game with them instead. Want to run an all priestess party? Sure, the game's probably still beatable as long as you know what weapons to use and master. The War God summon system with Gungnir is also really dang cool. I like the fact that they stay in line with the idea of how uncontrollable the power of the gods truly is. The War Gods chooses the targets pretty randomly, but with a slight lean towards how badly your side is doing. That just like how the resistance is relying on outside powers they don't truly understand because of how desperate they are, the player should also only utilize the War Gods when their backs are to the wall as well. The beat and TP system adds an additional layer of depth on top of everything we've already covered. Balancing TP is an integral part of the game, and the beat system, which utilizes that resource, is fantastic at making players really think about their positioning alongside the whole passing turn system. Gungnir is a truly wonderful game that is kinda hampered by one annoying problem, and that problem specifically is the difficulty. For those of you who've watched my look at Riviera, this will sound familiar, yet the problem is completely different. Unlike Riviera, where the game is just kinda too easy in general, Gungnir's issue is that its two initial difficulty settings are both a bit too extreme. The basic difficulty is a tad bit too easy. It's not so easy that you can just completely ignore every mechanic and just throw your main character at everything, but it could definitely push the player a lot more, which would force them to utilize the crazy amount of mechanics in the game. It is still the difficulty I recommend for anyone playing Gungnir for the first time though, because the alternative, the advanced difficulty, entirely expects the player to have already mastered every single mechanic. If you don't understand how to build a decent character, what weapons you can master early on in order to have access to status effects, what even is the beat system, and how to maximize the environment to your advantage, you aren't going to beat any of the stages past the halfway point. I know this because I was someone who went through the first playthrough on advanced difficulty, and it was not a pleasant experience. Gungnir really could have used a difficulty in between basic and advanced, a normal difficulty if you will. It would really help out the players who only tend to play games once. As it stands, I recommend that for first timers, they start Gungnir on the basic difficulty, and if they find that too easy by the halfway point, then just restart onto the advanced difficulty. Gungnir is a game that does lend itself to multiple playthroughs, but that's not because of the story, but rather because of the depth of gameplay present. The game has two endings, but nearly the entire game leading up to the ending is exactly the same. So the only reason to be doing multiple playthroughs is to experiment with different team compositions, or to challenge yourself on a higher difficulty. If you play the game smart enough, you could prevail with just about any team composition you could think of, and the advanced difficulty warrants enough of a challenge that if you want a game that really pushes you, then Gungnir serves to scratch that itch. So I think I've gotten as far as I can without going to any spoilers, so if anyone's still interested in playing Gungnir, feel free to skip ahead using the chapter links where I'll talk about my concluding thoughts about this entire franchise. Otherwise, feel free to stick around. Okay, so now that the only people left here are those who A, already played it, or B, just want to hear me talk more about the game, let's talk about the big elephant in the room. I mentioned during this entire retrospective that I actually kind of like the story in Gungnir, and I would probably be the odd one out because generally people don't have the best opinion of the story. I do understand why people think that way though. Even before reading the developer interview in the Gungnir art book, it's pretty clear that at some point in development, the story took a massive change in focus. It's why plenty of plot points in Gungnir just kind of fall by the wayside. All the supernatural elements like Gungnir, the war gods, Elise the Valkyrie sent from Asgard, all of that is left pretty much entirely unexplained from beginning to end, as instead the focus is shifted entirely onto the more human side of Gungnir with Giulio, Elissa, Paolo, and Ragnus. We never do find out why Gungnir appeared in front of Giulio. The only important part about the spear is that it allows Esperanza to fight back, and it forces Giulio to act as the figurehead for the rebellion. It also acts as the big impetus that reveals the crack in the relationship between Ragnus and Giulio. The two brothers' relationship is probably what drives Gungnir's story as a whole. One of the amazing things that Gungnir does well is that the entire story is portrayed from the point of view of Giulio, as he is the main character. So from our point of view, we aren't really privy to many of the details surrounding each character up until later in the story. Ragnus, from Giulio's point of view, is a brother that he's incredibly proud of. Competent, smart, kind, cool-headed, and a leader that everyone looks towards. He's such an amazing guy that Giulio has kind of developed an inferiority complex and is content to follow in his brother's footsteps. It's why when the spear appears, Giulio wholeheartedly embraces it as he believes this is his chance to prove himself to Esperanza, the organization his father left behind, and his brother. What Giulio never really sees until it's too late is the fact that while he always thought of himself as inferior, Ragnus wrestles with these thoughts all the more so. He always felt the fact that he was not a true child of Ricardo unlike Giulio, but rather adopted during the Spada massacre. He has also faced much criticism from those in Esperanza for being Daltan, that even though he's poured his entire life into fighting for the Leonica, the very same people tend to look down upon him. These problems are then exasperated when Giulio becomes the figurehead once he attains the Gungnir, and people begin to disrespect Ragnus even within earshot. All of this, including Paolo, is what ultimately drives Ragnus to go against Giulio and Esperanza near the end once he finds out his true origin as Daltan royalty. Paolo is a similar story where Giulio and subsequently we the players view him as a jolly old man, the wise mentor figure, and a parental substitute for the Rago children. What we don't see, even really until the end, is the way that Paolo kind of manipulates Ragnus, where he's the one who proposed to capture the child prince and raise him as a weapon to use against his father. Paolo is probably the one who pushed Ragnus to become the leader, and it's that betrayal among other things that leads to Ragnus standing against Giulio at the end. As for what happens afterwards, the game doesn't really show, which is what a lot of people don't like about this ending, although it's implied that he became the new Astro Heir after killing the Emperor. Elissa is interesting as well. While she has many parts to her that are similar to Yggdra, even down to the point that both of them are royalty and their ultimate goal is to retake the country, Elissa is probably the more nuanced character. While she still has the whole innocent noble princess thing, she's the one who understands the intricacies of the Garganian politics more than any of the other main characters, and she's also the one who teaches Giulio that there's a whole lot more to obtaining rights for Leonica, aside from just swinging around a mythical godlands. Elise is the last main character. That said, again, she kinda gets shafted by the fact that it feels like at one point, she was meant to be much more integral to the plot, but thanks to the shift to focusing on the human side of Gungnir, she's just kinda there hanging alongside Giulio and the rest of the party the entire time. At the very least, her deadpan self wins the award for being the cutest member of the cast, so she has that going for her. I think the dynamic between the cast is easily the best out of the entire Dept Heaven franchise as a whole. Now, the other reason why people tend to look unfavorably towards the story of Gungnir is most likely due to the fact that the story doesn't exactly have a satisfying conclusion. For the law ending after beating Zayad, Elissa reclaims the throne while Giulio and the rest of the Esperanza gets thrown into prison. In the Chaos ending, Giulio assumes that Elissa has betrayed them and leads Esperanza to escape. Afterwards, he's seen trying to plot the next rebellion against the current Empress. However, in the law ending, Giulio trusts in Elissa and accepts being thrown into jail. They eventually do get to leave thanks to Elissa, but there isn't this big celebration or anything. They don't even get to meet Elissa now that she's the Empress and is in a position that they can't ever hope to touch. Robertus, the strongest man of the Empire, one of the biggest driving forces for everything that happened, the guy who killed Ricardo, Giulio's father, and the one who forces Elissa to throw Giulio in jail, is still perfectly alive right next to Elissa. While he's only doing what he considers best for the Empire as a whole, it doesn't help the fact that nearly every player probably hates him for all the strife he caused throughout the entire game. If you meet the special requirements for the Law Plus ending, we get a cute extra cutscene where Elissa finally gets to see Giulio, and everyone just hangs out and has a warm meal together, which is nice. While we don't really learn anything further about Gungnir, and Elise is just kind of hanging around because she likes the crew, I guess, I think the ending does stick to the themes that Gungnir is trying to convey, that bringing change to the Empire isn't something as simple as taking down the top dog, but rather something that comes about gradually and slowly. After the huge revolution, nothing really big has changed, yet. with the key word being yet. A magic spear won't mysteriously solve all the problems that are already present, as it is humans first and foremost who have to take matters into their own hands. The game ends with Alyssa giving Giulio a regal cloak, and then offering him a position of Royal Guardian Knight. However, Giulio declines this in favor of helping those in the front line, hoping to exact changes there rather than being around someone he cares about. They reaffirm to stay friends no matter what happens as the scene fades to black. It's a touching scene that I think ends the game nicely, even if it isn't what all the players hoped would happen at the end. So now that we finally reached the end, I thought I should, talk a bit about my concluding thoughts on this entire series as a whole. Dept Heaven is a series of games that is easily characterized by one word: unique. Sting has tried to push the envelope of what they could do with each game. While Riviera was fairly tame for the most part, every single subsequent entry has tried to completely revamp their game system, which is probably what I appreciated most about the Dept Heaven franchise as a whole. It was incredibly fun following this franchise way back when Yggdra Union was being released. It gave me something to look forward to when starting each new entry, like, what would this game end up doing? What kind of crazy system will Shinichi Ito try this time? What would the story be like? It's great when the next entry in a franchise is an improved and better version of the previous game, but I think it's far more interesting when the new entry just throws out everything we've known beforehand and aim for something completely different. Another part about the Dept Heaven franchise that I really loved was the difficulty in their games. In a world where video games have constantly tried to lower the skill floor in order to be as accessible to as many people as possible, the Dept Heaven franchise wasn't afraid to offer a challenge in all of their games. Yes, some of them have easier difficulties for those who are just there for the story, such as Nights in the Nightmare, but for those looking for a challenge, the experience is there waiting to be had. The intricate systems in each of the games were fun to engage with because they offered a good reason as to why the player should bother with them, since they're gonna get the ever-living stuff and kicked out of them otherwise. For those of you who've watched all of the previous parts of this retrospective, you'll know that this series can be rough in places. Many of them run into the same issues, the tutorials are not the greatest, there's a huge amount of information that the player needs to play the game as best as they can, and usually it's just not provided in a reasonable fashion. And sometimes, the secrets are a little too hidden for any sane human being to find them. Nights in the Nightmare had that ridiculous trapdoor, and Gungnir is also a prime example of this, where the secret ending requires fielding Alyssa in every battle without letting her fall once, which is impossible for the player to know in any aspect. I didn't even bother mentioning the tons of hidden items in every single battle that the player would never find normally, or the annoying treasure chest system present. I was never really a fan of the whole percentage upgrade system, which started being implemented the last two games. Seems like an unnecessary hassle, especially when they happen during intermission where you can save, which seems to just promote save scumming. There are a lot of tiny things such as this that kind of bother me in every game. What makes Dept Heaven worth experiencing beyond all these tiny nitpicks, however, is just how unique of a game each one truly is. They may not be the most polished games I've ever played, nor are they the most accessible, but what I can say is that each and every entry is memorable in its own unique way. Even over a decade and a half since I first played this franchise, I still have a soft spot in my heart for these games. I would have loved to have seen a future entry in the franchise, to see where Dept Heaven decide to head next after all the craziness they've already shown, which is probably never going to happen. Yggdra Union, Nights in the Nightmare, and Yggdra Union got a Switch remaster, so it's not impossible, but something tells me Shinichi Ito isn't working for the company anymore. Anywho, if you got anything you want to talk about for Gungnir or any of the Dept Heaven franchise, feel free to do so down in the comments below. And can you believe I initially thought I could finish all of this Dept Heaven retrospective in 2 weeks? Yet, here we are almost 3 months later. I already did my whole spiel about the Dept Heaven retrospective as a whole, so all I'm gonna say is that if you like what you saw, all the supportive stuff is in the same place as always, like, subscribe, notifications, and especially hit that notification all buttons to get notified when my next video comes out. As now I'm finally done with this retrospective, I can jump into all of the other games I've wanted to talk about. With that, I'll see you later. Till next time.